The cloth. There is a piece of linen in a cathedral in northern Italy. It is kept in a climate-controlled reliquary behind bulletproof glass, in a chapel attached to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. The cloth is old, very old, though precisely how old is the question that has consumed scientists, theologians, historians, and skeptics for more than a century. It is approximately 4 meters long and just over a meter wide, made of a herringbone twill weave that was sophisticated for its time. It is yellowed with age, marked by fire damage and water stains and the accumulated traces of centuries of handling and storage. And on its surface, faint, brownish, embedded in the uppermost fibers of the fabric, there is an image. The image shows the front and back of a human body, as if the cloth had been laid over a man and then folded back, capturing both views. The man is tall for his era, perhaps 5 feet 11 inches by modern estimation, remarkable height for a medieval European. He is lean. His hands are crossed over his pelvis. His face is bearded. There are marks on his body, at the wrists, at the feet, on the side, across the back and shoulders, marks that, to those who look at them and believe, are consistent with the wounds described in the Gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. The Shroud of Turin is, to those who believe it authentic, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, the most sacred object in Christianity, the physical remnant of the central event in human salvation. It is, to those who do not, a medieval forgery, a remarkable artistic and technical achievement, but a human creation nonetheless. For more than a century, science has been trying to settle the question. It has not succeeded. Tonight, we are going to sit with the cloth, with the image, with the evidence, and with the argument. Not to resolve it, the argument is not mine to resolve, and perhaps not yours either, but to understand it. To feel the full weight of what is contested and why. Let's begin. The documented history of the Shroud of Turin begins, insofar as we can pin it down, in the mid-14th century. The first unambiguous historical record of the shroud is from 1354, when it appeared in the possession of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, at a church he had built in the town of Liray, in the Champagne region of France. De Charny was a notable figure, a celebrated knight, the author of a treatise on chivalry, a man of considerable standing at the French court. He never explained how he had come to possess the cloth, and the question of its history before Liray is one of the central mysteries of the shroud story. Almost immediately upon its public display, the shroud attracted controversy. The local bishop, Henri de Poitiers, conducted an investigation and concluded that the image was painted by an artist, a conclusion he reached, apparently, in part because he claimed to have identified the painter, though no name was ever recorded. The bishop ordered the display stopped, and for a period of several decades the cloth was withdrawn from public view. In 1389, the cloth was displayed again, now in the possession of de Charny's granddaughter, Marguerite de Charny. A new bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote a memorandum to the Pope protesting the display. In his memorandum, d'Arcis repeated the claim that the image had been painted by an artist, and added that his predecessor had found the very artist who made it. The Pope's response was ambiguous. He permitted the display to continue but required that it be identified as a representation rather than the true burial cloth. The cloth remained in the de Charny family until 1453, when Marguerite de Charny transferred it to the Duke of Savoy, Louis I. From then on it was in the possession of the House of Savoy, which kept it primarily in Forgery, France. In 1532, the chapel in Forgery where the shroud was kept caught fire, and the folded cloth was damaged by heat and by the molten silver from its reliquary container. The Burn marks and watermarks from this fire are still visible on the cloth. The cloth was repaired by Poor Clare nuns, who patched the burn holes with pieces of linen. In 1578, the shroud was moved to Turin, where it has remained ever since. In 1983, the House of Savoy, in exile following the establishment of the Italian Republic, bequeathed the shroud to the Holy See, to the Catholic Church. It is now the property of the Vatican, though it remains physically in Turin. This is what we know about the cloth's history. Before 1354, before Lirai, before de Charny, there is nothing. No document, no account, no verified reference. The most sacred object in Christianity, if it is authentic, appeared from nowhere in the mid-14th century. The image on the Shroud of Turin is strange. Stranger than almost anyone who has not examined it carefully realizes. It is not a painting. Or rather, it does not behave like a painting. The image is formed by a discoloration of the uppermost fibers of the linen, a yellowing that is confined to the very top layer of the threads, with no penetration into the body of the cloth and no evidence of any applied pigment in the image-forming regions. This has been confirmed by microscopic analysis and by chemical testing. The image is a negative. It was not until 1898, when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photographs of the shroud and developed them in his darkroom, that this was discovered. When Pia looked at the negative of his photographs, he saw, for the first time in history, the image in positive form, the face of a man, rendered in three-dimensional clarity, staring back at him from the photographic plate. The original image on the cloth is a negative. The photograph of that image, in negative, reveals a positive. The discovery electrified the religious world. A photographic negative of an image that had existed for centuries, revealing a positive image of a face that looked, to those who saw it, like the face they had imagined. It was, for believers, miraculous. For skeptics, it was a puzzle. How had a medieval forger, presumably working before the invention of photography, created an image that functioned as a photographic negative? The image contains three-dimensional information. This was discovered in the 1970s by researchers who used a device called a VP8 image analyzer, an instrument originally designed to convert light intensity values in photographs into three-dimensional topographic maps, to analyze the shroud image. When the image was fed into the VP8, it produced a coherent three-dimensional rendering of a human figure. Ordinary photographs do not produce coherent three-dimensional renderings when analyzed this way. The shroud image does. This suggests that the information encoded in the image's density variations corresponds to the actual distance between the cloth and the body it covered, that the image was formed by some process in which the intensity of the mark left on the cloth was related to how close the cloth was to the body surface. No conventional painting technique produces this property. In 1978, a group of American scientists conducted the most extensive direct scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin ever performed. They called themselves STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and they spent 5 days in Turin, working around the clock, with an extraordinary array of scientific instruments brought directly to the cloth. The STURP team was not composed of believers. It included physicists, chemists, photographers, textile experts, and medical professionals, scientists from a range of disciplines who had been given unprecedented access to the cloth for the purpose of determining its physical and chemical properties. Some were Christian. Some were not. The investigation was designed to be as objective as the circumstances allowed. Their findings were published over the following years in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and they were, in several important respects, remarkable. They found no evidence of paint, dye, or pigment applied to the image areas. Some iron oxide particles, rust, were found dispersed across the cloth, including in image areas, but the distribution and concentration were inconsistent with the iron oxide being the image-forming substance. The iron oxide appeared to be contamination from centuries of handling, not the cause of the image. They found that the image was formed by a process that affected only the topmost fibers of the cloth, a process that produced a chemical alteration of the linen itself, specifically an oxidation and dehydration of the cellulose in the surface fibers, similar to what happens when linen yellows with age but concentrated in the image-forming areas. They found blood, or rather, a substance that tested positive for blood in multiple chemical tests, including tests for hemoglobin and for serum. The bloodstains on the cloth were distinct from the image. They were not formed by the same process, they contained different chemistry, and they appeared to have been deposited on the cloth before the image was formed. In some areas, the image is absent in regions covered by bloodstains, as if whatever formed the image could not penetrate the blood. The STURP team could not explain how the image was formed. They concluded that no known medieval or modern technique could have produced it. They could not determine whether the cloth was authentic or a forgery. What they could say was that the image was not a painting in any conventional sense. In 1988, 3 laboratories, in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, performed radiocarbon dating on samples of the Shroud of Turin. This was the test that everyone, believers and skeptics alike, had been waiting for. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic material to determine its age. Applied to the linen of the shroud, it should have produced a definitive answer. The 3 laboratories, working independently and blind, produced consistent results. The samples dated to between 1260 and 1390 CE, with a 95% confidence interval. Medieval. Not 1st century. The announcement was made in October 1988. The scientific consensus, the radiocarbon evidence, placed the shroud firmly in the medieval period. It appeared to confirm the hypothesis of Bishop D'Arcis: the cloth was a medieval creation. For many people, that was the end of the matter. But the controversy did not end. It intensified. Defenders of the shroud's authenticity immediately challenged the radiocarbon results on several grounds. The most significant challenge concerned the samples tested. The samples had been taken from one corner of the cloth, the same corner, it was later argued, from which the nuns who repaired the fire damage in 1532 had used patches of later linen. If the samples included material from those medieval patches, they would date to the medieval period regardless of the age of the main cloth. This reweave hypothesis was developed most extensively by a materials scientist named Raymond Rogers, who obtained threads from the sample areas after the 1988 dating and subjected them to chemical analysis. Rogers found that the chemical composition of the sample threads was significantly different from threads taken from other parts of the shroud, a difference he attributed to the use of different, later dyed linen in the repair patches. He published his findings in the journal Thermochimica Acta in 2005. Rogers's analysis was contested. Other researchers argued that the chemical differences he found could be explained by differential contamination rather than by the presence of repair patches. The debate over the radiocarbon results has continued ever since, and it has never been definitively resolved. Whatever the shroud is or is not, the wounds depicted on it have been the subject of extensive forensic and medical analysis, and the results of that analysis are, in themselves, remarkable. The bloodstain patterns on the shroud, at the wrists, the feet, the side, the head, the back, are consistent with the wounds described in the crucifixion accounts in the Gospels. But they are consistent in ways that suggest either direct knowledge of a crucified body or, if the shroud is a forgery, an extraordinary degree of forensic sophistication that would have been unusual in the medieval period. The most notable detail involves the wrist wounds. Medieval artistic representations of the crucifixion invariably show the nails driven through the palms of the hands, as tradition depicted and as most people picture when they think of crucifixion. The shroud shows the wounds at the wrists, not the palms. Modern forensic research has confirmed that nails through the palm cannot support the weight of a human body on a cross, the tissue tears. Nails through the wrist, between the bones, can. This anatomical accuracy was not part of the medieval iconographic tradition. It is either a remarkable coincidence, or evidence that the image was formed from a real crucified body, or evidence that whoever created the shroud had access to information that contradicted the artistic tradition of his time. The blood flows on the shroud have also attracted extensive medical attention. The patterns of blood flow from the wrist wounds show two distinct directions of flow, consistent with the body having been in two different positions, the upright position of crucifixion and the horizontal position of being laid down for burial. The flows from the head wounds are consistent with a ring of punctures around the head, consistent, believers argue, with a crown of thorns. More than 40 years after the Stirp investigation, the mechanism by which the Shroud of Turin's image was formed remains unknown. This is not a small admission. It is the central scientific mystery of the shroud. The image has properties, its surface chemistry, its three-dimensional information content, its negative character, that have resisted explanation by any known process, medieval or modern. Several hypotheses have been proposed. The most scientifically credible natural hypothesis is that the image was formed by a spontaneous chemical reaction between the cloth and volatile compounds released by a human body, ammonia from decomposition, perhaps, or other organic chemicals. This hypothesis explains some features of the image but not all, and it has never been reproduced in laboratory conditions. The most dramatic hypothesis is that the image was formed by a burst of radiation, specifically, a brief, intense emission of ultraviolet light or other electromagnetic radiation from the body surface. This hypothesis has been developed by various researchers and is capable, in principle, of explaining the image's surface chemistry and three-dimensional properties. Some who hold this hypothesis connect it to the resurrection, to a moment of transformation or release of energy that left its imprint on the cloth. The radiation hypothesis has not been proven. It is speculative. But it is also, in a narrow sense, falsifiable. It makes predictions about the image's properties that could be tested with sufficiently detailed analysis. What is not speculative is the simple observation: we do not know how the image was formed. After a century of scientific investigation, the mechanism remains unknown. The cloth is in its reliquary. Behind its bulletproof glass, in its climate-controlled environment, preserved with every modern technology available. It is exhibited to the public rarely. Expositions are major events, drawing millions of pilgrims from around the world. Most of the time it is simply there, in the dark, in the silence. In Part 2, we go deeper into the science, into the specific evidence on both sides, into the arguments that have continued for a century and show no sign of ending. Rest here. Let the cloth be still. In Turin, the cathedral is quiet. The cloth is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. The evidence. Evidence is a strange thing. We tend to assume that evidence speaks for itself, that facts are facts, that data is data, that if you look carefully enough at something, the truth will eventually emerge. Science is built on this assumption, and for the most part it is a good one. It has taken us from candlelight to nuclear power, from astrology to cosmology, from superstition to surgery. But evidence does not always speak clearly. Sometimes it speaks in contradictions. Sometimes two sets of evidence, each internally consistent, each carefully gathered and honestly reported, point in opposite directions. And when that happens, when the evidence fractures along a fault line that also happens to be a fault line of faith and belief and identity, the contradictions become almost impossible to resolve. The Shroud of Turin is the most prominent example in modern history of evidence that does this. On one side, the radiocarbon dating, the documented medieval history, the arguments of art historians and skeptics. On the other, the Stirp findings, the blood chemistry, the anatomical accuracy, the inexplicable image formation mechanism. The evidence does not point in one direction. It points in two. Let me try to walk you through both sides with as much fairness as I can manage. The case that the Shroud of Turin is a medieval forgery rests on several lines of evidence, and the strongest of them is the radiocarbon dating. The 1988 tests produced consistent results across 3 independent laboratories. The methodology of radiocarbon dating is well established, and the results of the 3 labs agreed with each other to a high degree of precision. The date range, 1260 to 1390 CE, places the shroud's linen in the medieval period with 95% confidence. This is not a fringe result. It is mainstream science. The historical record reinforces the radiocarbon case. The shroud's documented history begins in 1354. Before that date, there is no reference to it in any surviving document, and the absence is significant, because the supposed burial cloth of Jesus would have been an object of extraordinary devotion that would have attracted extensive documentation if it had existed and been known. The Church maintained detailed records of important relics. Pilgrims wrote accounts of their visits to sacred objects. The silence before 1354 is not proof of anything, but it is suggestive. The art historical evidence is also relevant. The style of the image, the proportions of the figure, certain features of the face, the way the hair falls, has been compared by art historians to medieval artistic conventions rather than to first-century Near Eastern visual culture. The shroud's figure looks, in some respects, like a medieval European representation of Christ rather than what a Palestinian Jewish man of the 1st century would have looked like. And the bishops at the time of the shroud's first appearance said it was forged. Henri de Poitiers and Pierre d'Arcis were not distant commentators. They were churchmen of standing who conducted investigations. D'Arcis's memorandum explicitly states that his predecessor found the artist who made the cloth. The fact that no name was recorded is frustrating, but the claim itself, from a credible contemporary source, cannot be dismissed. Every line of evidence against the shroud's authenticity has been challenged by its defenders, and the most sustained challenge has been directed at the radiocarbon dating. The reweave hypothesis, the argument that the samples tested in 1988 were taken from a region of the cloth that included later repair patches, has been developed in considerable technical detail. Raymond Rogers's 2005 paper in Thermochimica Acta presented chemical evidence that the sample region contained chemically distinct material. Other researchers have conducted statistical analyses of the data from the 1988 tests and argued that the variations among the samples are too large to be consistent with a single homogeneous piece of linen, that the data properly analyzed, suggests the samples contained material of different ages. These arguments have not been accepted by the radiocarbon community as invalidating the 1988 results. The counterargument is that the chemical differences Rogers found could be explained by contamination and by the different preservation conditions of different parts of the cloth, rather than by the presence of a medieval repair. Without a new dating, with samples taken from multiple locations on the main body of the cloth, with careful attention to sample selection, the argument cannot be definitively resolved. And a new dating has not been performed. The Catholic Church has been reluctant to authorize further destructive sampling of the cloth. The shroud custodians have resisted proposals for additional radiocarbon testing. This reluctance has itself become part of the controversy. Skeptics see it as institutional defensiveness, and believers see it as appropriate protection of an irreplaceable sacred object. The situation is therefore this: the only comprehensive radiocarbon test of the shroud produced a medieval date. The methodology was sound. The results were consistent. But questions about the sample selection have never been fully resolved, and no further testing has been authorized to address those questions. The bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin have been the subject of intense scientific attention, and the findings are, depending on your perspective, either compelling evidence of authenticity or an illustration of how easy it is to see what you want to see in ambiguous data. The STURP team found substances in the bloodstain areas that tested positive for blood in multiple chemical assays. Later analyses by the Italian researcher Pierluigi Baima Bologna identified the blood as type AB, one of the rarer blood types, but not impossibly rare for a Middle Eastern population. The patterns of the bloodstains have been analyzed by forensic pathologists and have been described as consistent with the wounds of crucifixion. The flow patterns, the clotting patterns, the distribution of the stains, all of these have been interpreted as consistent with blood deposited by a real crucified body. But here the skeptics raise an important point. A medieval forger with knowledge of crucifixion, and such knowledge was widely available in the medieval period, when crucifixion was studied as a theological subject and depicted in countless artworks, could have applied blood to the cloth in patterns consistent with a crucified body. The presence of blood on the shroud does not, in itself, establish that the blood was deposited by the crucified Jesus rather than by a medieval forger's model. The counterpoint is the specific details. The serum separation visible in the bloodstains, where the cellular component of blood has separated from the serum, as happens in real wounds, is consistent with real blood behavior and difficult to replicate with applied blood. The anatomical accuracy of the wrist wounds, inconsistent with medieval iconographic tradition, suggests either real crucifixion wounds or a forger who knew more anatomy than his contemporaries. In the 1970s and 1980s, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey analyzed samples of dust and pollen from the surface of the Shroud of Turin and identified pollen grains from a wide range of plant species, including species native to the region around Jerusalem, to the Anatolian Plateau, and to medieval Europe. Frey argued that the geographic distribution of the pollen grains was consistent with the cloth having been present in Jerusalem, then in Constantinople, then in Europe, a route consistent with one proposed provenance for the shroud before its appearance in Lirai. The presence of pollen from plants native to Palestine, Frey argued, was evidence that the cloth had been in that region. The pollen evidence was initially taken seriously by some researchers. It has since been substantially discredited. Frey was found, after his death, to have fabricated evidence in an unrelated case. The authentication of the forged Hitler diaries, and his scientific credibility was severely damaged. More specifically, Critics of the pollen evidence argue that the identification of pollen grains in microscopic samples is subject to significant error, that contamination could explain the presence of pollen from distant regions, and that Free's conclusions went well beyond what the evidence supported. The pollen evidence is now regarded by most shroud researchers, on both sides of the debate, as unreliable. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of motivated reasoning in the investigation of a contested object. The mysterious properties of the shroud's image have attracted not only scientific analysis but also, in recent years, the attention of artists and imaging specialists trying to reproduce it. Several attempts have been made to create a shroud-like image using medieval techniques, rubbing, painting, contact printing with a carved relief, and some of these attempts have produced results that superficially resemble the shroud image. The skeptic Joe Nickel produced a linen contact image in the 1970s using a rubbing technique that he argued could explain the image's properties. The Italian researcher Luigi Garlascelli produced a version of the shroud image in 2009 using a bas-relief method and medieval available chemicals. The defenders of authenticity have argued that none of these reproductions fully matches the shroud's properties, specifically the three-dimensional information content and the restriction of the image to the topmost fibers. These properties, they argue, have not been reproduced by any known technique. The argument about image formation is essentially unresolved. Skeptics say it can be explained, believers say it cannot. Both sides have published papers. Neither side has produced a demonstration sufficiently convincing to persuade the other. Where does the scientific investigation of the Shroud of Turin stand today? It stands in an uncomfortable and honest place, genuinely unresolved. The radiocarbon dating says medieval. The image chemistry says we don't know how it was formed. The blood analysis says there is blood, but interpretation of what the blood means is disputed. The historical record says there is no documentation before 1354. The forensic analysis says the wounds are anatomically consistent with crucifixion in ways that go beyond medieval convention. None of these findings contradicts the others as definitively as they might seem to. The radiocarbon dating could be wrong if the sample selection was compromised. The image mechanism could be unexplained and still be medieval. The blood could be real blood applied by a sophisticated forger. The historical silence before 1354 could be a gap in the record rather than proof of absence. The science, honestly evaluated, does not resolve the question. It deepens it. The cloth is what it is. Linen threads, a herringbone weave, a faint brown image that has defied a century of analysis. Blood, or something that behaves like blood. A negative that became a positive in a darkroom in 1898. In Part 3, we go to the world that produced this controversy, to the history of relics, of faith, of the relationship between science and belief that makes the Shroud of Turin so much more than a piece of old cloth. Rest here. The cathedral is dark. The reliquary is sealed. The question is open. Faith and forgery. To understand the Shroud of Turin, you need to understand the world of relics. Not the world of modern secular skepticism, which tends to view relics with a mixture of incomprehension and faint distaste. Not the world of modern religious devotion, which tends to view them with a reverence that bypasses questions of authenticity. But the medieval world, the world in which the shroud emerged, in which it was displayed and venerated and disputed, a world in which the physical remains of saints and the instruments of Christ's passion were among the most powerful and contested objects on earth. In the medieval world, relics were not merely symbols. They were points of contact with the divine, objects through which the power of the saint or of Christ himself could reach into the physical world, could heal the sick and protect the faithful and secure God's favor. Pilgrimage to major relic sites was one of the central religious practices of the era, a physical journey undertaken in the hope of spiritual benefit. The great cathedrals were, among other things, relic shrines, places where the bones of martyrs and the instruments of Christ's suffering drew pilgrims from across Europe. The market for relics was, predictably, enormous. And the supply could not always match the demand. The trade in relics in medieval Europe was one of the largest and most economically significant cultural phenomena of the era, and one of the most prone to fraud. The demand was real and urgent. Every major church wanted relics. Relics brought pilgrims. Pilgrims brought offerings. Offerings funded construction, maintained clergy, and supported the entire apparatus of ecclesiastical life. A church with good relics was a prosperous church. A church without relics was a church that struggled to attract the faithful and their generosity. The supply, necessarily, could not keep pace. There was only one true cross, but fragments of it were distributed across hundreds of churches. There was only one crown of thorns, but thorns claimed to be from it were venerated in dozens of locations. The bones of individual saints were divided and subdivided until a single martyr might be simultaneously present in reliquaries across half of Europe. Not all of these relics were fraudulent. Some were genuine. But the conditions of the relic economy, the enormous financial incentives, the limited ability to verify claims, the deep religious desire to believe, created an environment in which forgery was widespread and, to some degree, tolerated. Pilgrims who received healing at a relic shrine did not typically ask whether the relic was authenticated. The experience of healing was the authentication. The Church was aware of the problem. Councils and papal letters periodically addressed the issue of false relics. Bishops, like Henri de Poitiers and Pierre d'Arcis, conducted investigations. But the Church was also, in many cases, a beneficiary of the relic economy, and its commitment to exposing fraud was uneven. The Shroud of Turin emerged in this world. It appeared at a moment when the relic market was mature, sophisticated, and prone to the production of exactly the kind of physically impressive object that would attract pilgrims. Whether it was genuine or not, its appearance was entirely consistent with the culture of its time. Geoffroy de Charny, the French knight who was the first documented owner of the shroud, is a figure of considerable historical interest in his own right, and his connection to the shroud raises questions that have never been answered. De Charny was born around 1300 and died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where he was killed while defending the sacred banner of France against the English. He was celebrated in his lifetime as a paragon of chivalry, the author of the most important treatise on knighthood written in medieval France, a man of unimpeachable reputation and considerable piety. He never explained where the shroud came from. This silence is either irrelevant or deeply significant, depending on your interpretation. Defenders of the shroud's authenticity have proposed that de Charny came into possession of the cloth through the suppressed order of the Knights Templar, that the Templars had preserved the shroud for centuries, possibly from Constantinople, and that de Charny's uncle, also named Geoffroy de Charny, had been one of the Templar leaders executed by the French crown in 1314. This hypothesis is elaborate and largely unsubstantiated, but it has the merit of providing a route by which the cloth could have traveled from Jerusalem to France without leaving a documentary trace. The simpler hypothesis is that de Charny or someone in his circle commissioned the cloth's manufacture. Medieval France had sophisticated textile workers capable of producing fine linen. It had artists capable of creating a remarkable image. It had craftsmen capable of forging virtually any religious object. The de Charny connection to the Templars, if real, could equally be an attempt to give the cloth a prestigious provenance that it didn't have. One of the most intriguing theories about the Shroud of Turin connects it to an earlier, different relic, an object known in Byzantine tradition as the Mandalion, or the image of Edessa. The image of Edessa was, according to Byzantine tradition, a miraculous image of Christ's face, not made by human hands, that had been preserved in the city of Edessa, modern Urfa in southeastern Turkey, since the 1st century. The image was brought to Constantinople in 944 CE, where it was venerated in the royal chapel of the Pharos. It disappeared from Constantinople sometime around the sack of the city by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, one of the largest acts of sacred looting in history, during which the relics of Constantinople were dispersed across the Latin West. Ian Wilson, a British journalist and shroud researcher, proposed in a 1978 book that the Mandalion and the Shroud of Turin were the same object, that the full-length burial cloth had been folded to show only the face, and that it was in this folded form that it was venerated in Constantinople as the Mandalion. If this hypothesis is correct, the shroud's provenance would extend from 1354 back to the 1st century, through Constantinople. The hypothesis is ingenious but contested. There is no direct documentary evidence linking the Mandalion to the shroud. The descriptions of the Mandalion in Byzantine sources refer to it as a face image, not a full-body image, though proponents of the Wilson hypothesis argue that the folded form of the full cloth would have appeared as a face image. And the chain of custody from Constantinople to Lirae remains unestablished. For believers in the shroud's authenticity, the cloth is not merely evidence of a historical event. It is a theological object, something that carries spiritual meaning beyond its physical properties. The shroud has been described by popes as an icon, a sacred image that mediates between the human and the divine. John Paul II, during a visit to Turin in 1998, described the shroud as a mirror of the gospel and spoke of it as an image that challenged viewers to contemplate the passion of Christ. Pope Francis, during his own visit in 2015, called it an icon of a man scourged and crucified. The papal language has been careful to avoid making dogmatic claims about the shroud's authenticity. The Catholic Church does not officially teach that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. It permits veneration of the cloth as an image of Christ, a devotional object, without committing to a historical claim that could be definitively falsified. This theological ambiguity is, to skeptics, frustrating. If the Church believes the shroud is authentic, why not say so? And if it doesn't, why permit veneration that most pilgrims interpret as an endorsement of authenticity? The Church's position reflects a recognition that faith and historical evidence are different kinds of things, that the spiritual significance of the shroud for believers does not depend on the outcome of radiocarbon tests. This is a coherent position, but it is also one that frustrates the scientific investigation, because it suggests that no amount of evidence could change the Church's relationship to the cloth. The tradition of skepticism about the Shroud of Turin is as old as the shroud's documented history. From Henri de Poitiers in the 14th century to Joe Nicol and Stephen Schaffersman in the 20th, there has always been a substantial body of opinion that the cloth is a forgery. Modern skeptics have developed the most comprehensive version of the forgery hypothesis, drawing on developments in forensic chemistry, medieval art history, and the history of relics. The case they make is, at its strongest, compelling. The medieval date from radiocarbon testing fits perfectly with the documented history. The appearance of the shroud in 1354 coincides with a period when sophisticated textile production and artistic technique were available in France. The forger, if there was one, would have had models for the image in the extensive tradition of Byzantine and Western European images of Christ. The bishop's contemporary testimony that a forger had been found is direct evidence that should not be dismissed. The skeptics are also honest about the things they cannot explain. The image formation mechanism remains mysterious. The three-dimensional information content is unusual. The anatomical accuracy of the wounds is genuinely surprising for a medieval forger. But they argue that mystery is not the same as miracle. The fact that we cannot explain how the image was formed does not mean it was formed by supernatural means. There may be a medieval technique, perhaps one that has not been rediscovered, that could explain all of the image's properties. The absence of an explanation is not proof of authenticity. The argument over the Shroud of Turin has continued for more than a century, through the development of modern chemistry, forensic science, radiocarbon dating, digital imaging, and computational analysis. None of these tools has resolved it. Why? Partly because the evidence genuinely supports both sides, in different respects. The scientific picture is more complicated than either believers or skeptics like to admit. Partly because the stakes are too high for either side to concede. For believers, the shroud is a potential connection to the most sacred moment in Christian history. The thought of conceding that it is medieval, that the cloth one has prayed before, that has brought comfort and devotion to millions of people, is a forgery, is not merely an intellectual revision. It is a spiritual loss. For skeptics, the thought of conceding that the shroud is authentic, that a miraculous image was somehow formed on the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, would require not just a revision of the radiocarbon evidence but a confrontation with implications that extend far beyond the cloth itself. These are not just intellectual positions. They are identity positions. And identity positions are among the hardest things in human life to change, no matter what the evidence says. The argument will continue. It has outlasted the bishops who first disputed the cloth, the knights who owned it, the nuns who repaired it, the scientists who tested it. It will probably outlast us. In Part 4, we sit with what the shroud means, not for one side or the other, but for all of us. For the question of what we believe, and why, and what it costs us to change our minds. Rest here. The cloth is in the dark. The argument is in the light. What we choose to believe. We have arrived at the place where the evidence leaves off and something else begins. Not faith, necessarily. Not skepticism, necessarily. Something more fundamental than either, the question of how we form beliefs about things we cannot directly observe, cannot personally test, and cannot verify with certainty. The question of what it means to believe something, and what it costs us when the evidence doesn't resolve the question we most need answered. The Shroud of Turin forces this question. It forces it more directly, more personally, and more urgently than almost any other contested object in history. Because the question it asks is not merely historical, not merely was this cloth made in the 1st century or the 14th, but theological, philosophical, deeply human. Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead? And if so, did he leave a mark? Those are not questions science can answer. But they are questions that science has, in this case, been asked to answer. And the result has been a century of controversy that tells us as much about the nature of belief as it does about the nature of the cloth. Science is the most reliable method human beings have developed for understanding the physical world. Its combination of observation, hypothesis, experiment, and peer review has produced knowledge of extraordinary precision and predictive power. The world we live in, with its technologies, its medicine, its communications, is a monument to what science can do. But science has limits. It is a method for investigating the observable, the measurable, the repeatable. It cannot, in principle, address questions that are not observable, not measurable, not repeatable. It cannot tell us whether God exists. It cannot tell us whether love is real in any ultimate sense. It cannot tell us whether a man rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. What science can tell us, in the case of the Shroud of Turin, is what the cloth is made of, how old its fibers are, whether there is blood on it, and whether its image was formed by any known technique. These are genuinely useful things to know. But they are not the same as the questions that believers bring to the shroud. The confusion of scientific questions with theological questions has been one of the central problems of the shroud controversy. Believers have sometimes treated a positive scientific finding, blood of the right type, anatomically accurate wounds, as confirmation of the shroud's religious significance. Skeptics have sometimes treated the radiocarbon date as a resolution of the theological question. Neither move is valid. If the shroud is medieval, if the radiocarbon date is correct and uncompromised, that tells us the cloth is not the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. It does not tell us that Jesus did not rise from the dead. The resurrection is not a claim about a piece of linen. It is a claim about a person and an event. The cloth could be a forgery and the resurrection could still be true. Every few years, when the shroud is exhibited, millions of people come to Turin. They come from across Europe, from North and South America, from Asia. They come in organized pilgrimages and they come alone. They stand in line for hours, sometimes days. When they reach the cloth, in its reliquary behind its glass, they have perhaps a minute to look. Many of them weep. What do they experience? What do they know that the scientists and the historians and the skeptics do not? They know something about what it means to stand before a thing and feel it. Not analyze it, not date it, not test it, feel it. The face on the cloth looks back at them from across whatever distance of time and authenticity separates them. The wounds on the hands and feet are the wounds they have prayed about since childhood. The stillness of the body is the stillness they have meditated on. Whether or not the shroud is authentic, it has been, for the people who venerate it, a vehicle for something real. The weeping is real. The prayer is real. The sense of proximity, of standing close to something sacred, is real, regardless of what the carbon dating says. This is not an argument for the shroud's authenticity. It is an observation about the relationship between objects and meaning, about the way that human beings invest physical things with significance that exceeds their material properties. The scientist who dismisses the pilgrim's experience as naive or irrational is missing something. The pilgrim who dismisses the scientist's date as an attack on their faith is also missing something. The full truth of the shroud, if there is a full truth, lies somewhere in the space between those two responses. One of the most consistent findings of cognitive psychology over the past several decades is that human beings are not primarily rational animals. We are rationalizing animals, creatures who form beliefs for reasons that have much to do with identity, emotion, and social belonging, and who then construct rational justifications for those beliefs after the fact. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. At least in some respects, the deep connection between belief and identity is part of what allows us to function as social beings, to maintain commitments across time, to care about things beyond our immediate self-interest. But it does make the evaluation of contested evidence very difficult. When a belief is central to our identity, when it is connected to our community, our family, our sense of who we are in the world, the prospect of revising it is not simply an intellectual challenge. It is an existential one. Both sides of the Shroud controversy are vulnerable to motivated reasoning. Believers want the Shroud to be authentic, and they find the evidence for authenticity more compelling than the evidence against. Skeptics want to debunk what they see as religious credulity, and they find the evidence against more compelling. Both sides read the same data and reach different conclusions, not because one side is more intelligent or more honest, but because they approach the data with different commitments that shape what they see. The honest response to this observation is not to give up on evidence, it is to hold our conclusions more lightly, to acknowledge the degree to which our reading of the evidence is shaped by what we bring to it, and to remain genuinely open to the possibility that we are wrong. After everything, after the radiocarbon dating, the STIRP investigation, the blood analysis, the pollen samples, the art historical comparisons, the forensic pathology, the image analysis, the reweave hypothesis, the comet hypothesis, the debates and the counter-debates, what is the question that remains? It is the same question it has always been. The scientific apparatus has changed. The question hasn't. Is this cloth the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? We do not know. We genuinely, honestly, after a century of serious scientific investigation, do not know. The radiocarbon evidence points one way. The image evidence points we're not sure where. The blood evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The historical evidence has a gap in precisely the wrong place. Every line of inquiry has been explored, and every line of inquiry has stopped short of certainty. This is not a comfortable place to be. Humans dislike uncertainty, especially about things that matter. And this matters. Either the most sacred object in Christianity is a medieval forgery, or it is what believers say it is, and the implications of both possibilities are enormous. But discomfort with uncertainty is not a reason to pretend certainty exists. The honest position is, we don't know. And that position deserves respect, even if it satisfies no one. One of the things the Shroud controversy has revealed, perhaps its most valuable contribution, if we are willing to learn from it, is the degree to which science and faith operate in different registers, address different kinds of questions, and are in some sense incommensurable. Science asks, what is this thing made of? When was it made? How did the image form? These are questions with, in principle, factual answers, answers that could, with sufficient evidence, be determined with confidence. Faith asks, what does this mean? What does it call me to? What does it reveal about the nature of the divine and the human? These are questions that do not have factual answers in the same sense. They have answers that are personal, relational, formed through interpretation and community and experience. The Shroud controversy has been so persistent partly because the two kinds of questions have been conflated, because both sides have treated the scientific question and the faith question as if they were the same question, resolvable by the same methods. They are not. A definitive scientific determination that the cloth was made in the 1st century would not prove the resurrection. A definitive scientific determination that it was made in the 14th century would not disprove the resurrection. The cloth is not the resurrection. It is a piece of linen, with a story attached. There is a spiritual practice in several traditions, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, of sitting with a question rather than rushing to answer it. Of allowing the question to be what it is, open, alive, generative. Of recognizing that some questions are worth living with, not because they will eventually yield an answer, but because the living with them changes something in us. The Shroud of Turin is an invitation to that kind of practice. Not to suspend judgment forever, not to abandon the tools of science or the demands of intellectual honesty, but to hold the question with something less than the desperate need for resolution that tends to corrupt the inquiry into contested things. The cloth exists. It is old. It bears an image. It has been prayed before by millions of people. It has been examined by scientists. It has been dated by laboratories. It has yielded no confession of its origins. It sits in its reliquary in Turin, in the dark, and it keeps its counsel. Maybe that is appropriate. Maybe some questions are not ours to resolve, maybe they belong to the gap between what we can know and what we need to believe, and maybe that gap is where the most important things happen. Or maybe the answer is simple, and we simply haven't found it yet. The cloth is in its case. It has been there for centuries, through the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, through the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, through the invention of photography and radiocarbon dating and digital imaging. Through every tool that human ingenuity has produced, it has remained what it was, a piece of linen, a faint brown image, a question. Millions of people have stood before it and felt the floor shift beneath their certainties. Scientists have bent their instruments to it and emerged with data that contradicts other data. Theologians have written about it. Artists have painted it. Popes have knelt before it. And still it does not speak. Still it keeps its secret, if it has one. Still it waits, in the dark of its reliquary, for something that may or may not come, for a question it may or may not be able to answer. There is something profound about an object that has outlasted every attempt to understand it. Something that speaks not to the limits of science or the limits of faith, but to the limits of both, to the stubborn persistence of mystery in a world that has worked so hard to eliminate it. We want to know. That wanting is one of the most human things about us. It drives science and it drives faith and it drives the pilgrims who stand in line for hours in Turin and the scientists who spend their careers analyzing old linen. We want to know what is real, what is true, what lies behind the surface of things. Sometimes, the surface is all we get. The cloth is old. The image is strange. The question is open. And in the dark of the cathedral, something waits. Good night.